Currently, mankind is caught up in a Ponzi scheme of epic proportions. It is somewhat difficult to understand, so please bear with me as I do my best to try and explain. The Ponzi scheme is real simple at its face. The banks loan governments, corporations, and citizens money, and then they tell these corporations, governments, and citizens, you have to pay us back more than what we have loaned. And it makes it impossible to repay the loans. Everybody then has to pay the principal, that's the amount that's loaned into the system, plus the interest. That's the amount of profit which is supposedly accruing. That's how much is being charged. The interest is never calculated as it accrues, or coined up into real money, or put into the system so that the system can pay back the principal plus the interest. Thousands of years ago, money first started. What is money? What is the economy? What is wealth? So, an economy is a system which creates wealth. I think it's defined as a community's system of wealth creation. And what is wealth? It differs from money because wealth exists in ideas that work. Wealth exists in the standard of living that people can experience when technology uses the resources in order to create a higher standard of living. So wealth exists in ideas that work, or that are put to work. For instance, a person who is in a field of wheat who didn't know what the wheat was, wouldn't know that they could take that wheat and thrash it and use the seeds, the grain, in order to create food. Smash it up, put some water in it, cook it, you got bread. So wealth exists by understanding the resources and the way to process the resources into goods and services which raise our standard of living. But what is money? Well, money is a material object, or a blip on a computer screen, or in the shopkeeper's days of old, marks in a ledger. Let's see, Tom, you owe $100. When your cattle come in and your crop sales or whatnot, you can bring that money back. So money exists as a representation of value. Now, in the old days, when money first started, the money was actually represented by things like grain or cattle. More modern days, we had things like gold and silver representing it. So, the things that we create with our wealth-bearing knowledge turn into what's called capital. Capita means head, it's per capita. It was how we would count our cattle. Let's got 1 head, 2 head, 3 head, 4 head of cattle. I got a lot of capital. So capital is the actual thing that has value. Capital is a car or a house or a farm or a cow. It's an asset. So where did money first come from? Long ago, the individual families within an agrarian community would take their, for instance, wheat from their crop, and they would take it to the central granary where it was stored and preserved better. They have archaeological digs in the Dead Sea area of Jordan where they have found adobe houses and a central adobe granary which is lined with limestone. So ingenious peoples figure out a way to make a relatively airtight and a waterproof container for the grain. Now, when the people bring their grain in, it will be weighed, and they will be given a chip or coin, or a colored seashell, for instance, and that would represent 1 pound of wheat. So this money, for instance, in the old agrarian days, had a standard which represented it. And this was the wheat standard. And in the future, in the wintertime, the people could come back and they could turn in their 1 pound chip or 10 pound chips of wheat, and they could get out of the granary, which is basically the bank, the deposit for all of the wealth, and they could take that 1 pound out. In the old days, then, money actually represented something of real value. Today, it doesn't have any representation of value. It's called fiat currency. They can print it up out of thin air without a real-world basis of wealth to represent it. They pretend it has real-world wealth because the way it works right now is the Federal Reserve Bank will loan money to the government, for instance, and the government will give them treasury bonds, which says to the bank, we'll give you back more money than what you're loaning us now. the way they do that then is by taxing the citizens. Another way that money came about was when the world around seagoing Phoenicians would visit their different ports of call. Now, the Phoenicians have been traveling around the globe since 1500 BC, as is taught in the United States Naval Academy. What they would do then is they would fill their holds in their ships with cattle, and they would take the cattle and they would trade for goods in these other areas which were not produced in their local area. Soon the trust of them showing up every single year or every season allowed the people to look forward to when the Phoenicians would bring their cattle, and they would trade them their potatoes or their carrots or whatever else they had, chickens, eggs, etc. Now, the Phoenicians could only bring so much cattle. So after they became trusted, what they would do is they printed up little coins. A little round coin, they had little horns like cattle. And when they got to these ports of call, they would be able to, for instance, once the cattle was mostly gone, they could say, hey peoples, can I just go ahead and give you this? And next year when I come, I'm going to redeem that for another cow or another cattle. But I'm going to redeem it in such a way that you only have to give me half of what you normally give me. So instead of 10 barrels of potatoes for the cow, you only give me 5 barrels of potatoes. It is in this way then that the Phoenicians would come back later and they would give a cow or cattle, and they would take back the coin. And the people then realized that, hey, I'm making a profit. And that's kind of where interest first came in. Take agricultural society. This is what the problem is with our current system in interest. See, the universe and our nature and our ecological system is capable of self-regenerating itself. So that if I loan you 100 pounds of wheat grain, and I tell you, I want you, after your season of planting, to give me back 150 pounds. That provides an opportunity for somebody to take that 100 pounds of grain, eat maybe 90 pounds of it, use 10 pounds for planting, grow approximately 1,000 pounds, and then take back that 150 pounds and give it back to me as I borrowed it. As I loaned it, under the conditions of interest. So, nature provides a way to self-regenerate itself. So if I loan you cattle with some males and some females, you can reproduce those and give me back more than I loaned you. Same thing with wheat. Same thing with anything that grows in universe, because the universe is eternally self-regenerating itself. That's the key to the problem with interest today. The interest is never coined up and replaced into the economic system. And that creates usury impossible to repay. And so occasionally, the bankers will slow down the loan process. The only way to pay your principal and interest is to pay your principal and the interest from somebody else's principal loan that was loaned into it before you or after you. Because most of us get our money from a workplace or job, whether it's self-employed or not, we don't realize that the only way that money comes into our finite economic system is through the loan process. The Federal Reserve Bank loans it to the government, and it loans it to its affiliate banks like Bank of America and Wells Fargo, etc. The fact that corporations and companies borrow money and then you get a paycheck from them does not then negate the fact that the only way the money gets into the system is through the loan process. And it's impossible to pay back the money that's loaned in plus interest. They might try and trick you by saying, oh, well, you get 0.5% for your savings account. The amount is so minuscule it doesn't change anything. It doesn't amount to anything. So when people say, well, we need to go back to a gold standard. Remember what happened when we got into the gold standard? That was around the Renaissance period, as far as when it really got started. And that's because we started using our ships to go down and take the ink and gold and the ink and silver. And so there was much more gold and silver in supply, and our monetary basis then, based on gold, was able to increase exponentially our endeavoring. Because money is really only what we believe in. There was a case a long time ago where in Italy there was some counterfeiting going on. This was 50, 100 years ago or more. So there was some counterfeiting going on, and what happened was that the banks wouldn't take the counterfeit money from the commerce people, the people who had storefronts. So the storefronts stopped taking the money from the people. And that seized up the economy. Remember, money is the grease which money is the grease which lubricates the wheels of commerce, right? So now the storefronts won't take it, so they can't pay the banks. And then the banks say, wait, whoa, slow down, now nobody's paying. So they said, hey, we'll take any money, counterfeit or not. So, and of course at the same time the police were investigating it was counterfeiting, but that alleviated the problem. The storefronts all said, hey people, we'll take your money. And then that started commerce again. So money is something that we believe in, but we have to understand how it's manipulated behind the scenes and how the economy then goes up and down. It goes up when they loan more money into the system. The way they loan more money into the system is they change the credit standards. They say, oh, you with a poor credit score, we'll still loan you money. So they lower it from a 700 beacon to a 600 beacon. And they say, you can buy a house, and you can buy a house, and you can buy a car. And then when they decide to slow down the loan process, they pretend that we're all deadbeats and we didn't pay back. And they then go ahead and lower that. They raise that standard for credit. Now you need a 700 beacon score plus 10% down to buy such and such. That slows down the amount of money. Same thing for businesses. Oh no, business, you can't borrow any money. Your credit limit's not the right one. So by loaning more money into the system, it's possible to pay back the principal that we borrowed last year and the interest which is accruing because we're taking that interest from the principal. So how do we resolve the problem? One aspect of it is to understand we can never go back to a gold standard because there's not enough gold in the world to represent all the things of value in the world that we are creating with our technology and our industry. We could, if we wanted to, use an electricity standard. The higher the standard of living, the higher the electrical output in the nation, in the city, in the community. That's kind of a given. And then that lowers the population rate. And then that causes other problems because of the Ponzi scheme. There's not enough people on the bottom paying for the Social Security and Medicaid for the people on top who had been paying into the system for the last 50 years. And that's why the system's going bankrupt. It's because of the Ponzi scheme. More money gets loaned into the system, and the money's not represented by real world wealth, by any real capital. So the interest creates usury because it's not added to the principal and not added to the finite economic system. So what needs to happen is we need to abolish the Federal Reserve banking system, okay, and then start a national banking system. And I know we don't trust the governments because the government officials and employees are corrupt. And we need to elect people that represent us. And you do that by stopping the campaign finance laws that are going on right now, and mandate that only $1,000 per citizen within that voting district can give to anybody who's running a campaign, and that'll stop the millions of dollars that are being paid to individuals who are running campaigns for our government offices by corporations and banks, which representatives then only represent the corporations and banks, which gave them the money to run that expensive campaign. If you don't have enough people backing you to get enough $1,000 from each of them in order to run a campaign, your ideas might not have been worthy to succeed. But we need humans who represent the citizens, not who represent the banks and the corporations. We've seen what they've done to our world so far. Okay? It's by suppressing technology and by misleading us with misinformation into more and more wars. So let's kind of explain here once again. We've got this finite economic system. The only money that gets into the system is through the loan process, right? Principal gets loaned in, right? From this finite system, they've got to pay out the same principal that got put in, plus the interest, plus from this finite economic system, we have to pay back to the government tax for the money that the government borrowed from the Federal Reserve banking system. Okay? You can see that the money that's loaned into the system isn't enough to pay back the loan, plus the taxes that we have, plus the interest. Now, if the government, or if the nation, or if the people, right, were in charge of themselves, we would start a system, and it would work like this. The government would loan money into the individual states' main banking system. Each state would have its own main central national bank or state bank. The government then loans the money into the finite system. It calculates how much interest is accruing on those loans that it's loaning in. It coins that interest up into real money, and that's the money that the government uses to fund itself. Roads, infrastructure, policing, military, hospitals, welfare systems, taking care of the poor and the elderly, creating jobs for the poor who want to work. Because if it decides that the interest is not enough to pay for everything that the government needs to fund, we can tax ourselves for a project if we needed to. We don't have enough money being calculated by the interest. We can go ahead and tax ourselves. We could say, hey, people are going to need to pay back a little bit of money. We're going to do a bridge tax. And that's it. Once the bridge is paid for, the tax is done. The government then prints up the amount of money that's needed. We loan it to ourselves. We pay for that bridge project. So the money's in the system. Got paid to all the workers and all the resources and all the companies that sold us the resources. So the money's in the system. So the system then has interest added to it, and any taxes are added to it. So the finite economic system is incapable of balancing itself out. We don't have a balanced budget because it's impossible to balance usury. Now, why do we have inflation? Inflation's kind of a few different reasons. Imagine in the old days, what we have right now is a fractal reserve system. Only a fraction of the amount of money that's in a bank, excuse me, the bank can loan out multiples more than the money that it actually has. That's called fractal reserve. It only needs to keep a fraction of its money in hold, and it can loan out 10 or more times the amount of money that it has. Now, if you or I as an individual citizen has money, I can only loan out the amount of money that I have. Hey, Tom, I'll loan you 10 bucks. You give me 12 back later? Okay, cool, it's a good deal. But I can't loan you millions because I don't have millions, but the banks can because that's the way they're set up. And that's not necessarily a bad thing as long as the money's always loaned into the system in accord with real world wealth. Most banks are going to say to themselves, now you want to borrow money because you're going to start a farm, and the farms in your area are producing this much stuff, and it will cost this much to start the farm and buy the stuff and buy all the seed and whatnot? Well, that makes sense. It looks like I could have you start that farm and make a big profit and pay me back my principal plus the interest. Now, in the states, individual banks and the individual banks in your individual community are doing this. They're doing the same thing. Accruing the interest, calculating it as it accrues, and then coining it up every month or every quarter, and then using that as the basis for the resource for all the citizens to create all of the things of infrastructure, all of the things which right now we think we're paying for by our taxes. Our taxes are really only barely paying the minimum payment on the $20 trillion debt that we currently owe. It's impossible by all laws of mathematics and physics to repay the debt because the debt was taken under this Ponzi scheme where the government kept on borrowing more money from the Federal Reserve banking system, which system started in 1913 in accord with an act of Congress. See, the founders of the Constitution understood this principle of usury and how banks were loaning money and then charging more than was loaned into the system in order to retrieve the goods, the property, the things of real world wealth in the future. When you can't pay back, you have to get back your car, your house, your factory, the farm, and then the bank takes that, and then when they decide to loan more money into the system, they say, hey, you guys, all this stuff's for sale, and we're loaning money, and then people come and they borrow money, and they start these farms, factories, buy the house and the car again. So once again, the way to resolve the problem then is to create a banking institution which represents the citizens of the United States. When you loan money into the system, remember, the government doesn't need to loan itself any more money, and that's what creates inflation. I'm sorry, I've kind of digressed. So in the old days, when I'd bring my 10 pounds of wheat and drop it off at the granary bank, and they'd give me a 10-pound note to redeem it, the amount of granary was always equal to the amount of money out in society. Now, what if these guys decided, hey, you know what? These guys never come back and get all the grain. At least half the grain's always still there. So let's print up more money. And we'll just go ahead and use it out in society. Now, just for instance, if you have 10 pounds of grain and a 10-pound note associated with it, 1 pound, right, $1 note or whatever for the 1 pound of grain. But if out in your society now you have 20 pounds worth of notes, right, and you only got 10 pounds worth of grain, that means you need to exchange $20, 20-pound notes for only 10 pounds of grain. So when you loan money into the system, there's no actual real-world wealth to represent it. Then there's more money in the system, there's the same amount of stuff. It takes more money in order to buy the same amount of stuff. And that usually, it's called inflationary spending right now, and that's all the money that is borrowed by the government. You have the government borrowing trillions of dollars from the Federal Reserve banking system. That money gets filtered into the system, right? The system has more money than the actual amount of capital or real-world wealth, and so it's impossible to repay. Starting a national banking system then, which does its best to only loan money into the system in accord with the real-world wealth that exists. Government spending is based on the amount of interest which is accruing on the loans, statewide, local-wide, and federal-wide. And we don't need to tax ourselves except in rare instances of budgetary crisis. So this is the problem with all mankind. It's a Ponzi scheme. Lord Rothschild said he doesn't care who's in control of the nation. He didn't care who its government is, whether it's communist or dictator or capitalist. All he cared about was who issued currency. Who was the bank that created this usurious scheme to take up all the property. Jefferson said, he was our third president, he said, God help the American people if they ever allow private banks to issue currency into their economic system. Because first by inflation and then by deflation, the banks and the corporations that grow up around them will deprive the people of all property until our children grow up homeless on the land that their forefathers had conquered. Now, when money gets so blown out of proportion that rich people in other countries are allowed to come in and buy our real estate, oh, I like some nice houses and some nice high-rises in New York and in LA and in San Francisco. It prohibits the citizens from being able to buy the land or even rent the land and survive. And that's what's creating huge amounts of homelessness, is people cannot live in these big cities where they were born, they grew up, and they work. It's because somebody comes in and they got so much money they say, I don't care how much it costs, I want that. How much is it for? It's $500,000. I'll give you $1 million because we're bidding on it. Everybody's bidding, right? And you're going to pay the very highest price that the bidder pays. And so now all the rest of the properties in the area, instead of being worth $100,000 or $200,000 or $500,000, now they're worth $1 million. And then the regular citizens who work for, what is your federal minimum wage? $7.75 an hour. How are you supposed to survive off of that? Until we Earthians understand the main root problems in our society and understand the proper steps to resolve these problems, there's probably no chance that humans will live more than 100 or 200 years. We're all stockpiling weapons for a purpose. Remember, what we believe to be true becomes true in accord with our thinking. It's like self-fulfilling prophecies. If our self-fulfilling prophecies are all of the arms manufacturers and all of the governments and all of the nuclear weapons continue to proliferate and to stockpile, we're going to be using them. Do you know why? Because it's all based on thought. Remember what the Buddha said at the beginning of the Dhammapada. All that we are is a result of all we have thought. It's based on thought, and it does not exist outside of thought. Think about what the Christian text says. Remember, I don't believe in any of your religions or your gods. But think about what it said. It said, we reap what we sow. If you plant or sow a thought, you will reap an action. You keep doing that action, right? You sow an action, you'll reap a habit. You keep sowing that habit, keep doing that habit, you're going to reap a character. You keep up that character, you sow that character, you plant it, you're going to reap a destiny. And that's what's happening right now. The thoughts are leading to actions in our world sphere. And these are creating habits, the way that we all interact. And this is creating the character of our various nations. And this is going to create the end. This is our destiny. Warfare until we're all dead. Polluting ourselves until we're all dead. Thanks for giving me this time. I'll come back soon.